Welcome to Adventures in Accessibility, a podcast that explores the far reaches of disability, access, and inclusion, with your host, Emily Schumann.
Welcome back, everyone. Today's guest is Dr. Anjali Forber-Pratt. Dr. Forber-Pratt is a disability activist, a two-time Paralympian, and the director of the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, also known as NIDILRR, in the Administration for Community Living. As a researcher, her primary area of work relates to disability identity development. As a wheelchair user for over 35 years, Dr. Forber-Pratt is nationally and internationally recognized as a disability leader and mentor. She was a White House Champion of Change in 2013, and the American Psychological Association awarded her the 2020 Citizen Psychologist Award for advancing disability as a human rights and social justice issue award. Welcome, Dr. Forber-Pratt. We're so happy to have you as our guest today.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here.
So some of our listeners might not be familiar with you and your story, so I'd love it if you could just kind of tell us about yourself in your own words.
Yes. Well, my name is Dr. Anjali Forber-Pratt, and I am an Indian American woman who was adopted from India when I was 2.5 months old. And 2 months after arriving in the United States, I got sick with transverse myelitis, which left me paralyzed from the waist down. And so I use a manual wheelchair, and I have an adorable service dog named Colton. And I am the new director of NIDILRR, the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research within the Administration for Community Living.
Yes, we love Colton. He's delightful. And so I know you've had your disability since you were, just like you said, when you were 4.5 months old. So how do you feel like that affected you growing up and throughout your life?
Having a disability for so long and really for as long as I could remember, it affected me in really profound ways in that it was something that has always been a part of who I am, but also it meant that I had to figure out how to develop in the world and navigate the world with a disability. Everything from, going to school to sports to social events with friends to then college and so forth. And I think that, it doesn't make one experience, harder than or better than another, but it's just very different versus some individuals who acquire a disability later in life. And so I think that that's something that I often think about. For me, what that really meant was as a young kid, I had to seek out the disability community and to kind of find my people, so to speak. Because every adult that I knew as a young kid, when I looked around and both on television and movies, as well as just in my community, every adult I knew could walk. And so I initially had a hard time envisioning a future for myself where I had a disability and that I got around in a wheelchair. And as a young kid, I actually believed everyone in the world had a disability and that it was something that I was going to just outgrow, which I was very, very wrong about. But it was because of that. It was because of that lack of representation, And so I think that really affected me profoundly in terms of needing to seek out and to find and to latch on to those role models.
Yeah, that representation is so important. And I know, I'd love if you could tell the story that you have about kind of when you were in school and ultimately taking on the school in court. And if you could just kind of share with us, the events that led up to that and how that went.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things about growing up with my disability was that for the longest time, accessibility fights with my school were always my mother's fight. So, and this was early on, that my mother had to advocate in order for me to first get assessed by the school district early intervention, had to advocate because when it was time for me to start kindergarten, the school that was closest to my parents' house, so based on the districting, didn't have a ramp and was not accessible and so forth. From those early days all the way up through middle school, it was always my mother really advocating and fighting and really advocating for my needs. When I was in middle school and in our district, middle school was 5th through 8th grade. And so as I was getting ready to think about the transition to high school, one of the things that we had been, raising questions about as early and as often as we possibly could was the known lack lack of accessibility of the older high school building at the time. And we kept being told, time and time again, oh, it'll be ready by the time she gets there. It'll be ready by the time she gets there. And, just kind of being a little bit brushed off, so to speak, in terms of all of it. And lo and behold, I started high school, and shockingly, it was not ready by the time I got there. So my very first day of high school, and this is such a vivid memory for me. I was, a lost freshman, as any lost freshman is on the day one of high school. And I, saw what I thought was a knowledgeable adult because they were dressed in, a suit and so forth. And I asked that individual, how do I get to room, A, whatever it was, right? And the individual said, you go straight down this hallway, you make a right through that set of double doors. Then the next set of doors, you'll go through on the left, and the classroom will be right in front of you. So I'm repeating that back to myself because I am terrible with directions just in general. And, and I followed the directions to a T, and, went through that first set of doors, made that first left through the next set of doors. And the classroom was right in front of me, but he had led me to a stairwell. And so that was my first day of high school. So I was late for my homeroom, for attendance and all of that, because I couldn't figure out how to get there. That was really just the beginning of a whole host of issues and challenges that I faced with the high school. It was both the physical layout and inaccessibility, but also the attitudes and the lack of support, and really the frustrations that I was feeling, both from everyone from janitors all the way up through to the superintendent, who just didn't believe in my ability to succeed in high school because of my disability. So early on, it was, we tried to be nice about it and write letters and advocate and, do all of these different pieces. For about a year, we did that and really, really tried to make it work. I don't tend to think that you try to go looking for trouble or looking to, to raise issues. You try to be nice about it and try to work with folks and all of that. But then, day one of my sophomore year, I had an English teacher. And at this point in time, we had determined the singular accessible area of the building. And so all of my classes were relocated there as a reasonable accommodation. And the teacher had to walk down a flight of stairs to where this classroom was, which was, accessible for me, and was taking attendance that day, and got to my name and said, what are you doing in an honors level English class? It's not like you can go to college anyway.
Oh my gosh. Horrible.
Yeah. And then she kept going and said that really I was just a major inconvenience to her. And, because of the accommodations and so forth. And for me as a teenager, that was my tipping point. And so I actually went and hired my own lawyers and sorted that out as a teenager. And I very boldly sat my parents down at the dinner table one Sunday night and said, Mom, Dad, I've hired myself a lawyer. You can support me if you want. You don't have to, but this is what I'm doing. And here's why. And this is why I think it's important. And it was the first time that I took on that advocacy role really in the driver's seat. And I will say they were extremely supportive. They were surprised, but they were extremely supportive of my decision. And they understood. And what I really had said to my parents was, I was the one facing it every day. I was the one dealing with teachers like this. I was the one that was enduring the ableism and the lack of accessibility, and it was affecting me. And that this was something that I felt I needed to do, not just for myself, because I also had a pretty keen awareness that I personally was likely not going to benefit from all of this, but I wanted to make it better for students with disabilities coming up after me, for, potentially teachers or parents with disabilities who might have children in the school and so forth.
The part of the story that I'm always, kind of stricken by is the fact that you managed to hire lawyers at around 15. So can you tell us more about how did you do that?
Absolutely. And yes, fun facts, right? For me, it was because of a lot of trust and support that I had found through disability sport was sort of how that came to be. And so the individual who I ended up, divulging all of what was keeping me up at night and what was frustrating me, was actually a ski coach of mine at the time, who had a disability himself. And he could just tell that, something was really bothering me, that I wasn't my happy-go-lucky normal self. There was something going on. And as a really good, strong mentor and just a loving person, he one day, quite literally on a ski hill, had asked me, had sent the rest of my teammates and so forth in and said, "Hey, what's going on? Like, talk to me," And I knew that he was a lawyer, but he was in real estate law. What I did not know was that he had a side passion for disability law, which makes sense, having a disability himself, but I didn't understand how lawyers work and specializations and all of that. And in that moment, he said, "Let me make a couple calls, but I'd like for our firm to be able to help you." And it was wonderful.
Yeah. Can you talk at all about the outcome of that lawsuit?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, it's interesting because what I know now as an adult versus what I knew then as a teenager, I am able now to look back on the settlement and how things went and view it very differently, and to really see it as some strong wins. I will be completely honest that as a teenager, how it all unfolded, I was still pretty frustrated at the time with what all happened. So for context, at the time, the federal court system was quite backlogged. And so when we filed the lawsuit, the soonest trial date that because it was set to go to trial, the soonest trial date that that had been assigned and so forth was actually going to be the July after I had graduated high school. So just again, for context, that becomes important because in the end, through court mandated mediation, my case settled in April of my senior year in high school. So again, that's years of literally going through high school with a federal lawsuit,
right.
Going on, which is, high school is a weird and awkward time anyway. Let me tell you, it's weirder and even awkwarder when you have something like this going on. So in April of my senior year, a settlement agreement was reached, and the district had to pay. I believe it was $110,000, which truthfully, that was majority of that was legal fees at that point in time. But what the other piece, there's several other pieces with that. So they did have to pay punitive and compensatory damages, which at the time, to my lawyer's knowledge, it was one of the first cases where punitive and compensatory damages were awarded under the Americans with Disabilities Act in a public education case. So that was precedent setting in that way. And it was also as a direct result of my case. And this is the part that, again, looking back at now, I see this much more as a win, that the superintendent of the district, the principal, the director of special education, and half the school board all left. And what I see now is that changeover in leadership and the magnitude of that change was tremendous. And again, as a teenager, you don't really understand how all of those systems work and what that really meant. The other piece that I strongly advocated for, and it did stay in and as a part of the settlement agreement, was that I wanted every district employee, everyone from the part-time bus driver all the way up to superintendent level, to go through a disability awareness and sensitivity training. As an adult, I know that sensitivity and awareness trainings aren't, the magical solution by any means. But what I felt very strongly was that so many of the comments and the interactions that I had with adults and educators just shouldn't have happened, and that there was just a strong lack of knowledge and lack of awareness, and so that was one other piece that I fought very hard for to stay within that settlement agreement.
Well, that's just remarkable. I think it does sound like a great outcome. So obviously, by the time you filed your lawsuit, you were familiar with the Americans with Disabilities Act, but I'm wondering kind of when did you start learning about that law?
Going back to that same English teacher for a moment, there was an assignment in that class. We were reading some Greek plays, and there's some famous Greek play where it's all about rules and laws and just like learning about laws of the land, so to speak. And the assignment was to pick and write about a rule or law that you feel passionately about. And guess who picked the Americans with Disabilities Act for this assignment? And it was because I was dealing with, all of the accessibility issues and so forth. Because of that assignment, I honestly remember staying up really late reading the ADA cover to cover and just really diving into it, which I know makes me sound like a very big nerd, which I am. And so, but I was really, it was really the first time that I had dove into it in that way. And it prepared me for the conversations that I was having with local advocates at the Center for Independent Living who were helping to support me and really helped to, in those early times of really trying to be nice right before we ultimately ended up filing the lawsuit, had helped me to make sense of what I was reading in terms of the ADA, but also to support me and encourage me to deserve the right to an education and to be in an accessible place.
What would you say to someone who, is kind of thinking, well, it's 2022, we fast forwarded, there's no accessibility issues anymore, kind of past that era. What would you kind of say about that?
I would say that it's easy to think that and to hope that that is the case, but you also have to remember that the world in which we live in also changes. And there are new things in terms of how we interact with this world that didn't exist when the ADA was written. And so there are new barriers that come up that in a lot of ways couldn't have even been, imagined or thought about at the time. And so that's one aspect. So for example, thinking about rideshare services, that wasn't a thing in the 1990s and things like that. But right. those present really difficult accessibility issues because of the fact that it's a personal vehicle. I mean, for a whole host of reasons, it presents some really interesting layers of issues. But at the same time, I would also say that unfortunately, even though the Americans with Disabilities Act has been around as long as it has, there's still a lot of inaccessibility that's out there. Unfortunately, disability is still often the afterthought. And some of the pieces within the Americans with Disabilities Act that really center accessibility and access and things like that are the first thing to be forgotten about, or when folks are looking for cost-saving measures, which leads to brand new buildings being put up where there can sometimes be ADA violations and so forth. And so, unfortunately, awareness from the broader community, not just people with disabilities, to be able to point that out and to realize and recognize and advocate that, hey, if we do this right the first time, we're going to prevent ourselves from problems down the line. And I say that we need not just disabled individuals, but our non-disabled allies to help to point that out and to advocate. The other piece that we hear constantly, and disability is not just those with physical disabilities, but this is one example where we hear like, oh, I didn't think of it until I had children and I started pushing around a baby stroller, or I didn't think of it until my own family member was having a decline in health just due to normal aging. And so that's one piece, is that overall awareness. A lot of times with disability, you don't think of it until you either experience it yourself or somebody close to you does. The second piece that I think is also fundamentally important, back to original question, is thinking about the huge advances in how we communicate and how we interact with the world and digitally and so forth, and the barriers that can present for individuals who are deaf, hard of hearing, who are blind, who might use alternative augmentative communication devices, Because again, if certain things aren't thought about proactively related to accessibility, screen reader compatibility, all of those types of pieces, it's much harder to go back and fix it after the fact. It's way easier to just build it accessibly right from the start. And it means that then so much of how we access knowledge in this world is not always equitable in terms of getting out to everyone.
And how is accessibility relevant to your current role as director of NIDILRR?
Oh my goodness. So importantly. So I think that in my role as director of NIDILRR, first of all, NIDILRR funds the ADA centers around the country. So we're so proud of that. And so that's certainly one way. But the other piece is at NIDILRR, we really are all about funding and creating knowledge to advance the research and knowledge base to help people with disabilities as independently as they can in the community and so forth. And so it's important to think about accessibility within the research enterprise as well. So making sure that our research itself is accessible, that the studies that we are funding have participants with disabilities across disability groups represented, that we have investigators with disabilities who are supported to do this type of work. And the last piece is the knowledge translation, that the information that is learned from these studies gets out not just to the broader research community, but out to the disability community, out to disability-related organizations, and that it can be used then to empower advocates, can be used to inform future policy decisions, can be used to really make a difference in people's lives.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I was reading about you that you're a researcher. Among other things, you've also been a champion Paralympian, but your primary area of research related to disability identity development. And that's something I'm really curious about, especially when it comes to people who acquire disabilities later in life. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that research and, what are some of the key things that you learned?
Yeah, certainly. So, disability identity development to me is really about how do individuals, develop an identity and a sense of belonging and a sense of community around disability. How much is that disability a part of who a person is or not? And I think that's another piece that's really important, is that for some people, it's a very salient, very critical core part of a person's identity, but it's not for everyone. But we have learned so much more about other markers of identity, and disability identity still remains much more understudied. And so that was one of the kind of my main drivers in terms of wanting to study and to explore disability identity. The questions that that you're asking, like what are the differences and so forth, as we started this conversation of growing up with a disability versus acquiring a disability, or the types of disability and what that might mean for disability identity, we quite honestly don't yet have answers on, because we haven't had strong ways of how it is to measure and to quantify and to understand disability identity. So a large part of my work before this role was really about building an evidence base that, hey, this is something that is important to study. These are some of the ways that we can identify and really define what we mean by disability identity. And then more recent work, we have been doing work with statisticians to really put together how is it that we would measure or could measure disability identity in terms of a survey or a scale. And so it's still ongoing work and is right now on pause while I'm serving in this also very important role. What I've been really impressed with is just how much more frequently I hear the word disability identity just being discussed and being talked about by other researchers and so forth. And so my hope is that this knowledge base will continue to grow.
And what would you like listeners to know about accessibility just broadly, and especially maybe those listeners who don't know much about disability or accessibility, or who don't themselves have a disability?
I love that question. I think I would say that accessibility has the potential to benefit us all, disability or not. It really takes all of us being champions to recognize that and to be able to advocate for that. And then the benefit ends up being tremendous for those of us with disabilities. And we need non-disabled or individuals that don't necessarily identify as disabled to help us to amplify those messages. So for example, in the place of of work where you are, if you're developing a video, asking, hey, where are the closed captions for that video? That benefits, yes, tremendously individuals with disabilities who are deaf or hard of hearing, but it also benefits individuals where English might not be their first language. It benefits individuals who with attention issues and where just reading text might be easier than trying to listen and interpret other stimuli and so forth. And so that's one example of something that is commonly thought of from an accessibility standpoint that really can benefit us all. And that's really embracing what in the disability world are these principles of universal design. And that's just one example of ways that folks without disabilities can help to move the needle forward on accessibility and help to be champions for us all.
I love that. Dr. Forber-Pratt, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners today before we wrap up our conversation?
I think just one last piece that I would say is that when I'm reflecting back about my experience as a young teenager, the value that came from having organizations such as you all as an ADA center and having individuals to reach out to ask about the Americans with Disabilities Act. And for me, as a person with a disability, just to have that resource was so tremendous. And for those without disabilities who might be encountering questions about accessibility and so forth, you guys are such a tremendous resource that I hope the rest of the world can take advantage of your expertise.
Oh, well, thank you. We really appreciate that plug. And we're so pleased, the whole ADA National Network is so pleased to have you as our leader. I think you're just such an impressive person. You've got great perspective. So we're really looking forward to the future with you at the helm.
Thank you.
Where can our listeners go to get in touch with you if they wanted to know more about you or, connect with you on social media, that type of thing?
Absolutely. Yes. So the easiest way is on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Anjali FP, ANJALIFP. That's quite honestly the easiest way. My email address is a little bit complicated, but I am happy to share it, which is Anjali, ANJALI .Forber, FORBER -PRATT @acl.hhs.gov.
And we'll put that in the show notes as well so people can copy paste.
Wonderful.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been a delight, and I hope you just take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Adventures in Accessibility. Tune in next time for another dive into the unknown.
Adventures in Accessibility is hosted by Emily Schumann, and Jessica Lucinia is our sound engineer. This podcast is a project of the Rocky Mountain ADA Center and is funded under a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. Grant number 90DPAD0009-01-00. This production is intended solely for entertainment and informal guidance and should not be considered legal advice. The opinions expressed by guests are not necessarily held or endorsed by the Rocky Mountain ADA Center.